Hello and welcome to a new episode of Africa as a Country Talk. I'm Sean Jacobs, streaming from upstate New York. And my co-host is Will Shoki, and he's streaming from Johannesburg in South Africa. AIAC Talk, or Africa as a Country Talk, is a weekly talk and interview show. We broadcast every Tuesday at 7 p.m. East African time, 5 p.m. in Dakar, or 6 p.m. in Johannesburg. Our show is produced, as always, by Antoinette Engel, who is in Cape Town, South Africa. This is episode 40. We have reached 40 under 40. We don't qualify for that anymore. 40, you know those 40 under 40 things that nobody
No,
reads?
we don't. We're past that.
We passed that. On today's show, we tackle Africa's long and evolving relationship with Asia. As Will wrote in the promo for the show, before the boring, well, let me pause. As Will wrote in the promo for this show, before the boring neutrality of the global South, we're going to get canceled for that, there was the counter-hegemonic posture of the third world. That boring line, by the way, got some Twitter reaction, so I suppose Will enjoyed that. Twitter love aside, what happened to Afro-Asia? Our guests, more on them later, are Chris Lee, who's a professor of history, Lina Benabdallah, who is a political scientist, and Abdul Rahim Lema, who is an international relations and politics scholar.
And as usual, if you missed our show last week, we continued exploring the concept of belonging through two sets of artistic works. The first one was a new film on a Libyan dissident directed by Khalid Shamis. The film is about his father, who was an opponent of Gaddafi, and it's during the rounds in the festival circuit. So you can check that out somewhere online, wherever you are. And the other was an exhibition on the Black experience created by Cedric Brown, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Fellows on Racial Equity. And it was curated by Odysseus Chirinza, who's a director of the Gallery MoMA in Johannesburg. So for that episode, we were joined by Khalid, Cedric, and Odysseus to discuss their works. And the whole episode is available on our YouTube channel. And subscribe, as usual, to our Patreon for all the episodes from our archive and to support our work in general. Now, for today's show, it just so happens that Ethiopia is back in the news. And this time it's for pro-government protests denouncing Western influence and meddling. Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who was once a darling of the West, I mean, the man won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019 famously, or infamously rather, in his Technicolor jacket, is now turning against the West. This after the United States placed economic and security sanctions on Ethiopia over the government's military intervention in Tigray, which many human rights groups are saying is starting to resemble a campaign of ethnic cleansing. We won't have time to analyze all of that now and here, but our viewers should do well to check out our past episode featuring Eleni Zantim Selek, which was on Ethiopia. And what Eleni did was provide a long historical background on the political crisis today. So what's interesting about what's happening in Ethiopia at the moment is that as Ethiopia is distancing itself from the United States and the West in general, it also has a strengthening relationship with China. So a recurring placard at these protests in Addis Ababa was "Fill the Dam," which is a reference to Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam project, which is opposed by Egypt and Sudan, but backed and partially financed by China. China, of course, notoriously built the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, and it is financing a new headquarters for the African Center for Disease Control, also located in Addis Ababa. Now, just a very quick aside, if the Chinese are interested in building headquarters for the Pan-African Parliament, which at the moment is based in this old convention center in Midrand here in Johannesburg, I would absolutely support it. My suspicion is that one of the reasons there's been so much fighting over the last couple of days is that the dignitaries are in an uninspiring location. So we need the help of the Chinese to give them some inspiration. But jokes aside, and this could be to overstate it, but what's happening in Ethiopia right now feels like an example of the Cold War-like diplomatic and geopolitical tensions we see playing out elsewhere on the continent and in the world. Now, I could be overstating, I could be oversimplifying, but fortunately today we have guests who actually know what they're talking about. So to try and help us understand not only China's relationship to Africa, but Africa's relationship to Asia as a whole, we're going to be joined by Christopher J. Lee, Lina Benabdallah, as well as Abdul Rahim Lema. And I'm sure we'll find out how this relationship with Asia started out differently and how it's evolved with complexity. So let's get right to it. A reminder before that to hit the like and subscribe button, as well as to head over to our Patreon to check out all of the episodes in our archive and to support Africa as a country's work.
Right, so our first guest then is Christopher Lee, an associate professor of history and Africana studies at Lafayette College in Eastern Pennsylvania. He's the author of 6 books, including of relevance for today's show, Making a World After Empire, The Bandung Moment and Its Political Afterlives, which is holding it up in 2010. Apparently there's a second edition that came out in 2019. So why don't we start with this question, Chris? Just tell us, for people who don't remember Bandung, what was that all about, and why is that meeting significant in the history of the relationship between Africa and Asia?
Sure. Well, let me thank you both first for inviting me to be on the program. It's great to be here. But yeah, just to get into the Bandung Conference, formerly known as the Asia-Africa Conference. It took place in April 1955 for a week from April 18th to 24. It had 29 countries from Asia and Africa, including the Middle East. And it basically was a diplomatic meeting during this important period of transition of the 1950s, where you had essentially empires in the process of collapsing. You have this, trend of decolonization, but you also have this rise of a new set of power relations through the Cold War. So between the United States and the Soviet Union, but then also eventually the People's Republic of China. So it was this period of transition in multiple ways. The countries that met in Bandung, and it should be said too that Bandung is this city outside of Jakarta on the island of Java in Indonesia. Maybe not an obvious place to have a meeting of this kind, but just to say that the Bandung meeting, it was initially intended to be one addressing different crises in Southeast Asia, but also in Asia more generally. So among them, the tensions between North and South Vietnam following the decolonization of French Indochina. You also the conflict on the Korean Peninsula between North and South Korea. But these initial crises that were found in Asia were seen as part of a broader situation that post-colonial countries were encountering. That is to say that, again, they were finding themselves, in this process of gaining independence, which was exciting. On the other hand, there were these new dynamics emerging, ideological ones between Western liberal democracies, the United States, and then the Soviet bloc and communism. So the Bandung meeting was very much a moment of trying to articulate a future for post-colonial Asia and post-colonial Africa. And, not to say that was an easy thing to do, but just to say that the meeting itself was tremendously symbolic. You had figures like Gamal Nasser of Egypt, Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Zhou Enlai from the PRC, of course, the host Sukarno of Indonesia. You also had the African-American novelist Richard Wright attend as an observer and wrote one of the most important accounts of the meeting, The Color Curtain, that came out in 1956. So it's this, even though it was a diplomatic meeting, it became a cultural moment. And it has gained a certain mythology since 1955. Perhaps I should stop there. I could keep going, but just to suffice to say that, in basic terms, it was a diplomatic meeting among countries, 29 Asian African countries, but over time it's gained much more meaning, and this is something that can be debated, and something that scholars debate. Was Bandung this shining moment, or is it overplayed? Is there too much mythology? Is this mythology appropriate in some way? Here we have. I see you're putting up images of the conference itself. One thing I'll say just briefly about connecting to the broader theme of Afro-Asianism, it is important to note that of the 29 countries in attendance, only 6 were from the continent of Africa, and so the agenda, as I initially pointed out, was tilted towards Asia and tilted in particular towards Southeast Asia. But it is important to note that even if Afro-Asianism, or one variation of Afro-Asianism, started in Asia, that I think the destination of Afro-Asianism was very much Africa. And we see this continuing up to the present in different ways, through especially China-Africa relations, of course, but also in other ways, India-Africa relations, things of this nature. So,
to ask a follow-up before we get into the question of what the destination of Bandung was, I want to touch on what you mentioned earlier. Why Bandung? Why was that city in Indonesia chosen to host this conference?
It's a good question. I think one reason is simply that it was a city that for which security could be provided. This is a major diplomatic meeting, the largest. It was advertised as the largest meeting of its kind in world history up to that point. There can be debate about that, of course, but in terms of the delegations and the representation of those delegations, basically the argument was that the countries in attendance represented much of the world's population, over 1 billion people. And so the upshot is that it is important to think about this as an important diplomatic meeting. Security was important. If you look at photographs of the meeting, there's a strong Indonesian military presence. And so I think one reason is simply that the city of Bandung was in a sense more easily secured than, say, the larger city of Jakarta. It should be said too that Bandung, it's a beautiful city. It's got a kind of local feel to it that would be appealing for a conference, especially a conference that's a week long. It's also a university town. Sukarno had received his university education there. Here you can see some of the level of security, but also, it's important to note that, this wasn't a secretive diplomatic meeting. You had Indonesians coming out onto the streets and, to see leaders. In this motorcade, you can see Sukarno, of course, wearing the fez. And then the Premier of the People's Republic of China, Zhou Enlai, who was a very important diplomat for the PRC and ranked just below Mao Zedong, the chair of the People's Republic of China. So this gives you a sense of the kind of spectacle that the Bandung meeting had in April 1955. So.
I think it's interesting that you just sort of in passing mentioned Sukarno, but I think it's fascinating at that point, I suppose, he was seen as a kind of he's communist, right? So he represented a certain kind of radical politics at that moment. And maybe to just make a connection there, there's also something about the period, this long history of Africans and Asians, and this kind of solidarity politics go further back. I was reading this week, for example, that Ho Chi Minh, when he was a young sailor, he was in the U.S. And he lived briefly in New York City. In fact, I think he lived in Harlem, and he had attended meetings of Marcus Garvey's UNIA, and he was impressed with Pan-Africanism. So it's not like Bandung. I mean, two things, I suppose. It's not like in terms of a Pan-African, there's the sort of the connections with Pan-African, like where it's going to end up, that those connections, they do predate Bandung. And as I also said, there's also a kind of fervent of a sort of left-wing politics, which is sort of, it's entangling. I don't know if that's the right word. Like these kind of young Asian and African nationalists in kind of the first half of the century.
Yeah, you're raising a number of important themes here, and so I mean, just to draw out a few of them. I mean, specific to Ho Chi Minh. I mean, Ho Chi Minh is this fascinating person who, had this complicated life, but an amazing one at the same time. And just to pick up on that thread, I mean, a lot of his early life is sort of under a cloud of mystery. But there is this great article by Brent Hayes Edwards, professor of literature at Columbia, who wrote The Practice of Diaspora and is, really important in African American studies. He wrote an article called The Shadow of Shadows that's basically about Ho Chi Minh and Harlem, or at least part of it is. And there's also, in addition to, having this connection with, Marcus Garvey, it's also understood that he had some connection with Korean nationalists at the time. And this is when Korea was under Japanese colonial control. Also, it's said that Ho Chi Minh witnessed a lynching in the American South. So there are these details that are really fascinating, but also unconfirmed. But just to say, but to bring out your broader point, I mean, I think it is, important to note that obviously Bandung isn't necessarily the starting point of all of this. And in fact, connected to radical politics, it's important to think about the 1927 League Against Imperialism meeting that the Comintern sponsored. I mean, Lenin was very much about Black liberation, and spreading communist revolution around the world. So, and this of course is before Lenin's early death, but it is important to think about the role of the Communist International in terms of connecting anti-colonial nationalists, anti-colonial socialists, and of course involving activists from African Asia. And so the 1927 League Against Imperialism meeting is another important moment in this history. The main difference between the League Against Imperialism meeting and the Bandung meeting is that the thing about Bandung is that you had countries that were independent, with some exceptions. That is to say, Sudan sent a delegation, but of course Sudan didn't become independent until 1956. The Gold Coast sent a delegation, but of course wasn't independent until 1957. So you did have some delegations, some countries that were would be independent in the near horizon, but weren't quite independent yet. But there is a fundamental difference between being, an activist, leading a liberation organization versus, a political statesman leading a country. And so that's why that is a fundamental difference between the League Against Imperialism meeting in 1927 and the Bandung meeting in 1955. But just to build on that too, it is important to think about how, Bandung wasn't simply, the politics were complex in terms of left and right, radical or more nationalist. I think that, basically the leaders who attended Bandung had different sets of ambitions. And so it's very difficult to, place them all in one category. Yeah, this is an image here of Nehru, of course, in the center, but also Gamal Nasser. Just to talk briefly about the two of them, one thing that's important about Nehru is he's one of the few who attended both the League Against Imperialism meeting in 1927 and the 1955 Bandung Conference. And so he very much is a person of connection and, sort of bringing together these two worlds, a world of activism with a world of post-colonial diplomacy and policy. It should be said specifically to this photo, one reason I really like this photo is that, Nehru is very much an elder statesman at this point. He's in his 60s, whereas Nasser had, effectively had just come to power in Egypt. He's in his late 30s, and basically, he's finding a sense of guidance, a sense of mentorship with Nehru. And so it's important to think about these meetings as not just a meeting of equals, but also the ways in which, there's a kind of, passing of the torch perhaps, or, kind of mentorship politics that's also occurring, that kind of thing. So,
and speaking of meetings, sorry to jump in here, but, Bandung eventually, it concludes, and there's a wave of decolonization, and not really much concretely comes out of that moment, but its spirit sort of lives on in these other meetings that happen. So there's in 1961 the convening of the non-aligned movement in Belgrade. In 1966 there's the Tricontinental Conference in Havana. So was Bandung the moment that really sort of spurred this third worldism politics beyond states and great leaders to more popular movements, or is it overstating to say that its spirit was lived on in these other formations?
Well, certainly, there's a lot of scholarly debate about this. I think that it's indisputable that Bandung is important in terms of, crystallizing what the third world might look like. Or what third worldism might look like. It should be said that, of course, with the non-aligned movement and its founding in 1961, it was a different configuration of nation states. So to be very specific, one country that fell out that wasn't part of the non-aligned movement is the PRC. Basically, China fell away, and that's one reason for that is that you had Chinese-Indian tensions in the intervening years between Bandung and Belgrade in 1961. So this gets to another point, that even though you had this sort of Bandung spirit and third world solidarity emerge from 1955, it's not to say that everyone got along. China and India, very ambitious countries, found themselves at odds, and particularly because they shared a border. And you had outright military conflict between both countries in the early 1960s. So basically, the non-aligned movement didn't involve China, didn't involve the PRC, and then you have, as you were pointing out, you have the Havana meeting in 1966, which of course brings in Latin America, brings in Cuba, Cuban Revolution, and so it's another configuration. So, I think the best way to think about it is not to create a hierarchy of, this is the most important meeting, or, this one's less important, but rather to think about the ways in which, third worldism evolved and how it incorporated, different geographies, how some, countries came into conflict with one another. And that, created, different concepts of third worldism. I want to say something quickly too. Because there are all these interesting details. It is important to note that there were unofficial delegations at Bandung, and one reason I want to bring this up is that Moses Katane of the SACP, of the South African Communist Party, was at Bandung, and he was also there with Ishmael Kachalia of the Indian National Congress and the ANC, the Congress Alliance. And the reason I bring this up is that the anti-apartheid struggle was discussed at the Bandung meeting, even though there was no formal delegation from South Africa. And I think it is an important moment for thinking about the globalization of the anti-apartheid struggle. That Bandung was discussed that apartheid was discussed at the Bandung meeting, and that apartheid South Africa and the issue of racism were elements of the final communique at the Bandung meeting. Also the Palestinian situation as well, the refugee situation. after the Nakba in 1948. So, which is just to say that, even though we might claim that Bandung didn't maybe accomplish much in concrete terms, I think there was this identification of issues that needed to be confronted in the post-colonial world, in the third world, and among these were Palestine and apartheid South Africa. So yeah, when Katane returned from Bandung to South Africa, this was written about in leftist publications like New Age. So there's a South African connection to Bandung, even though there wasn't an official South African delegation to Bandung.
Thanks for that, Chris, and thank you so much for this. We hope you'll stick around, because we want to bring you back later when we talk about whether or not the legacy of Bandung really has permeated into the present moment. But we want to bring on our next guest, who is Lina Benabdallah, who is going to help us unpack that present moment. And she's an assistant professor of politics and international affairs at Wake Forest University. Her research focuses on international relations theory, foreign policy, critical theories of power, and knowledge production and hegemony in the global South. And she's the author of Shaping the Future of Power, Knowledge Production, and Network Building in China-Africa Relations, which was published last year with the University of Michigan Press. So, Lina, thank you very much for joining us on the show today. And we've just heard of what Chris was describing now, this mid-20th century moment, how China eventually sort of fell away from this kind of third world posture. And when you think about China then and you think about China now, a lot of people are sort of claiming that the US and China are bringing us closer to another Cold War. So when statements like that are trumpeted around, do you think they're overblown, or is there a little bit of truth to that?
Well, thank you both for the invitation. This is a wonderful opportunity to talk about these themes. Yeah, I mean, I think the spirit of Bandung in many ways still lives in the present moment when it comes to China-Africa relations. If anything, it lives in a very discursive way, in a very performative way. But as we all know, those aesthetics and the discourses and performances and the spectacle, as Chris said earlier, are all important to politics. Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting that you bring up the question of the the quote unquote new Cold War. Yeah, I mean, when I see analysis that kind of talk about U.S.-China relations today in those terms, and of course I can't help but basically see the differences in the context in what was going on. I want to go back to the Bandung Conference in 1955. Although Algeria was still not an independent country, it still had quite a bit of terrain to go in terms of its anti-colonial war. There was a delegation that attended the Bandung Conference, and right as the conference ended, the main newspaper at the time, called Al-Mujahid, wrote an article basically reporting on the conference. And the way that it was described in the conference was basically this moment where Afro-Asian peoples and nations are able to gather and in the absence of the main powers. And in the quote from Mujahid, it basically says US, European, and Russian powers. So there was, in a way, a defiance of global great power politics that came out of Bandung that was celebrated by people, that this is a moment of defiance, that this is a moment, however symbolic it is, it's a place to meet and talk about politics at the time in the absence of being sort of handheld by these great powers. This isn't the case today. It will be really difficult to imagine a meeting of a sort that China doesn't, get a seat in at. It would be difficult to imagine. In fact, as of today, the largest number of African leaders, this is presidents and heads of states, who have gathered at a meeting together, is actually at the China-Africa Forum of Cooperation. So this gives you an idea. So I would have a hard time thinking Al-Mujahid would come back and write something like that about a meeting that would say, thank God there's no China in the U.S. I actually don't see that happening, right? So the context in that way are a little bit different, but there's also this irony that, much of that Afro-Asian solidarity in the 1960s fell apart because of Sino-Soviet divides. It wasn't necessarily because of US-Soviet Union competition. It was actually the Sino-Soviet divide that brought down a lot of that solidarity. Maybe the short answer to the Cold War.
That was a great answer, actually, and I love how you linked it back to this by using the example of Algeria to kind of make those connections. That was a brilliant answer. So just to connect to that, as you said, like today, everybody's gathering at a meeting, because as you said it, I was like, yep, that's the next one. That's the new Bandung, if you want, under different conditions with its own motives. You were quoted in an article in the South China Morning Post detailing China's funding of government buildings all across Africa, which is to get to why all these people are at these meetings. Can you just say a little bit about that, about what China does now in Africa, because it's now the sort of dominant kind of representative, if you want, of Asia, and what do you think China's motivations are for or what are their motives for these initiatives, if you could speculate on it?
So there's no doubt that China is playing a dominant role in terms of building infrastructure all around the continent of Africa. What's kind of interesting about that infrastructure is that when you build a road or a bridge, a lot of people benefit from it. Or when you build a power grid, people that benefit from it can be local people, can be foreign companies coming in to set up shop, can be transnational enterprises, whatever. So it's not, a road or a bridge, it just doesn't belong to whoever built it. So it's important to note that, in a way, framing Chinese built infrastructure in Africa as a threat it just doesn't make sense, really, to use a kind of a broad brush to paint it all with the same color. Now, in terms of infrastructure buildings that are related straightforward to government buildings, and those basically critical or sensitive infrastructure deals. Now it's kind of interesting because the way that this has been reported is that there's a shortcut. Essentially, every time that there's a news piece that a Chinese state-owned enterprise is building, usually given as a gift, a parliament building or a foreign ministry building, or renovating one of these critical building infrastructure projects for African countries, there's a shortcut sort of insinuation that there's some corruption going on, that there is some insidious deal, basically, that China is going to essentially tap the building, and that there's going to be all kinds of sort of allegations and accusations of spying. We've seen that with the building of the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. This was a building that was completed in 2012, given as a gift, as in terms of the building by China to the African Union. And we keep seeing almost every year, you'll see Le Monde or you'll see some other newspaper, typically from Europe, bringing in a story about how Huawei wired the building, and how that there is issues of surveillance and issues of basically listening in on conversations and all that. So those are the conversations around the buildings, is basically who's wiring it. And the second thing is, what are Africans given in return for these buildings? And again, there are speculations about what is it that we're paying the Chinese companies with.
To jump onto that and ask about exactly that point, one of the big sort of things that is peddled whenever there's a new infrastructure project is that they say that the Chinese are embarking on these to sort of set up a debt trap. So the idea is that China makes a generous provision of capital for these projects to be built, and there seem to be no sort of strings attached. They're not attached to conditions like IMF loans would be. But then the trick is that in the end, when African countries sort of default on debt repayments or whatever it is, then China is going to swoop in and seize on these assets. And recently there's a welcome body of scholarship that shows how this is just not true, but it's gained so much traction. And I think that in the mainstream sort of consciousness, a lot of people believe that this is genuinely something that the Chinese government is doing. So why has this myth become so popular, and why is it sort of treated as a piece of conventional wisdom about Sino-Africa relations?
I mean, it depends on who you ask, but Orientalism is a very quick answer to that, because ever since we saw this reboosting of China-Africa relations in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, almost every month there's a new concept that has something attached to diplomacy. So we saw checkbook diplomacy, and then we saw, it was like one after the other, and then the vaccine diplomacy, the mask diplomacy, and the debt trap diplomacy. All these things are very recent concepts of the last year and a half. We will keep seeing a lot of these terms that just attach the word diplomacy, and they are basically they insinuate, again, corruption. They insinuate insidious, nefarious motives by China, and also, sort of infantilizes African leadership for falling in these traps. I mean, who falls in the trap, right? It's not that they're not making these traps. Essentially, they're not agents of what's going on. Like you said, the scholarly community is pretty much, there's almost basically like very little debate that this debt trap diplomacy does not describe China-Africa relations in many ways. This isn't to say that there are no issues. This isn't to say that there are no challenges to China's financial and the financial sustainability of Chinese projects in Africa. Of course, there's a lot to talk about there. But in terms of the concept itself, it takes, it became so viral because it's this quick way of describing. It's just packed with all these insinuations and meanings, and I think if you look at it, like, these concepts are not Africa made. They're not generated in the continent. They're not coming from China, but they are these quick shorthand ways of describing China's diplomacy. I think to the question of where we at with the debt trap diplomacy, I think it is basically clear if we read scholarship that there, of course, we don't have any certainty at 100%, but there's really no evidence to back the argument that the Chinese government is on purpose giving loans to African governments that are too big for them to pay back. And in a way, these loans are going to lead to essentially conceding assets to Chinese companies. So that's kind of in short the answer.
And coming now to what the purpose of the African countries on the other end are, I think, we shouldn't sort of, it's not as if China at the end of all of this is some sort of misunderstood protagonist. And it seems that one thing that it's certainly influencing African countries is providing it a vision for development for themselves. So a lot of African countries are increasingly inspired by the Chinese regime of authoritarian state capitalism as being a viable development and growth model that they can emulate. So in terms of that, I mean, how widespread is that on the continent in your impression, this idea that African countries look to China as representing a viable growth model and try to embrace the Chinese way as far as government and statecraft is concerned? And is it actually viable on the African continent, or would it be a miscalculation on the part of these countries? Maybe the circumstances and conditions just don't provide for that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's basically, in terms of how widespread this is, it would make sense actually to look at it's ebb and flow, that there are these perceptions of who are the great powers or who are the aspirations for models. I mean, not long ago it was Turkey. Everybody wanted to emulate the Turkish model. It was this secularism meets all things that everybody wanted. And then, that kind of goes away, something else comes back. In many ways, that's sort of where we are with China. It's this sort of this peak moment of both being able to see what is going on in China, as opposed to the 1970s and 80s and 90s, when that exposure, the level of exposure, wasn't that great in terms of Africans. But at the same time, I think there's of course, I can cite Afrobarometer surveys, both in the last, the 2014 and 15 round, as well as the one from last summer. They basically are all showing sort of positive perceptions of China in the continent. So the surveys are conducted in 36 or 37 across 37 African countries, and they ask Africans basically a bunch of questions. Some of them are about China. And the answers were overwhelmingly positive, but this doesn't mean that that it's all sort of a kind of a positive, good story, kind of a fairy tale story in that way at all. We see a lot of challenges to China from the continent. We saw that through COVID-19 and the treatment of African diaspora in China. We keep seeing that in terms of challenging Chinese infrastructure projects that have impacts on environment, have impacts on indigenous populations' rights to land ownership, for example, and other issues. There's a whole lot of diverse voices and challenges. And but what's important about this, and I will finish this answer with this, is that it's important that this kind of reaction comes from within the continent and not become some sort of bargaining chip that other powers are using against China, not for the purpose of advancing any interests that African populations and peoples have, but for the purpose of this sort of great power politics game. So I think that it's important to note and work really seriously through these challenges, but in doing so, giving voice to people from within the continent and not falling in the trap of sort of this, for that sort of big kind of great rivalry kind of politics.
Yeah, one more question before you go, Lina. Just getting back to something you mentioned about kind of charting alternative paths, and if we just look, for example, and I just wanted to ask you about vaccines, because you mentioned this kind of sort of rhetoric about vaccine diplomacy. So that aside, and just to broaden it out a little bit beyond China, we've talked about how there's also a way in which the policies of vaccines, where I would say China, Japan, even how Vietnam handled COVID, can be seen as alternative paths or ways to think about drug economies or to think about public goods. Can you? I mean, what are your views on that kind of politics? Sort of a way, as you said, from this kind of bargaining chip, global, these kind of great power contest, and more towards like, and beyond, I suppose, what Will was talking about before this kind of authoritarian state capitalism as a model. These kind of there are other things that are also part of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Sean, for that question. I expected actually to see a little bit more inspiration and a little bit more positive perceptions of the way that the Chinese government handled the COVID-19 here, essentially in Algeria, and through exposure to what people are saying in the media across the continent. Because at some point, if you remember, in March 2020, about March of last year, there were all kinds of social media coverage of these really basically light speed hospitals being built across China. Basically 24 hours you have a hospital. And basically the messaging by the Chinese government at the time was to try to show capacity, to show that because it's so central, the governance of the country is so centralized under the CCP, that you're able to achieve so much so fast. And that your quick reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic is going to be a lot more centralized and more efficient in that way. I expected, honestly, to see a lot more positive impacts of those images and those messaging in Africa than I actually found. It's interesting. What I found to be the main lesson, especially here in Algeria, where there are no vaccines, there's no plan for vaccinating anyone. There's not even 1% of the population that has been vaccinated yet, and it's already June. The sense is that the country needs to build its own infrastructure for producing these things, even if it doesn't have the technology to invent the vaccine, that it should have a production unit. And the government is basically going towards that direction of making itself independent of at least that distribution chain, that if it's not able to invent it, it's able to produce it secondhand. And that would actually shorten the distance between people's arms and jabs, essentially. And that is what's going on right now, is that realizing how dependent we are on, technology providers, on health vaccine providers, on all these things, that there is a conversation towards rebuilding, restructuring these very vital institutions domestically.
That's a good note to end this part of the program with Lina Benabdallah. You've been a great guest. This was really informative, and stick around because I think at the end we want to just come back for a little bit. So our next guest, who's our final guest, is Abdul Rahim Lema, who's from Benin, and he is a Yenxing Scholar of Peking University, where he completed a master's degree in China Studies, focusing on politics and international relations. His research focused on South-South cooperation, triangular cooperation, and the growing Sino-African security and development relations. Just as an opening question, because I know, Abdul, you have written about this on Africa as a Country on the website, and I would recommend that people go read some of your pieces. When Africans migrate from the continent, we usually think of them as going either to Europe or the Americas, but a lot of Africans do go to Asia. So from your experience and from your experience being in China, how big is this migration or movement? And can you say a little bit about who are these Africans who go to China and just more widely Asia, and why do they pick Asia?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me around, and thank you for the invitation. To answer your question, I think we need to keep in mind that in the Western world, there is the so-called the crisis of migration, and also the fact that migration has now become not only a politically speaking, domestic issue, but also interstate relations, in the sense that the issue of people moving around has been, securitized. So, which makes it very difficult for Africans, generally speaking, to, get visas to, say, the European Union member countries, or even to the United States, especially under Donald Trump. I think that is one thing. The other factor is also that, as China grows, China has become a kind of model, because considering just less than 50 years ago, China was a backward country, to use the concept quote to quote. compared to African countries, but today being able to pull itself out of poverty and becoming a great power, it also an inspiration. So as for the communities, like African communities in China, I think one could distinguish three types. The first one, whose history is very long, are the traders, like African traders in first Hong Kong, and then moving on to the southern part of China, including Guangzhou and Shenzhen, which basically explains, the growth of China, like the ability of doing business, basically, becoming, a growth, space, a market space for trading goods, especially cheap goods. So that explains the pulling factor toward the country. The second type of, immigrant or African diaspora you find in China, now the growing one are the students like myself, who go there to study, because as we know, through the South-South cooperation or even under FOCAC, China has been pledging and also like keeping its promises in terms of training African, not only students, but also officials. So due to that fact, many African students get scholarship, or they also go there to study on their own, basically through their own financial support. But the scholarship side is the largest, or scholarship student, the largest community of Africans throughout China. And the third type are diplomats, like state officials and so on and so forth. But focusing on those two, like traders and students, I think those are the ones that get the chance to interact with the Chinese, their Chinese counterpart, their Chinese people, basically, on their daily lives, not only in the marketplace for traders, but also at schools. So that helps explains the growing interaction between the two, basically from the concept of people-to-people exchange, because we know that China-Africa relations has mostly been written through state-to-state or government-to-government relations. But I think the reality today is a growing trend of people interacting. The reverse is also true, like from Chinese people traveling to African countries for trade and looking for some other opportunities.
Thanks. That was actually a very comprehensive breakdown of who is in China, and I'm sure we can also generalize that to the rest of Asia. And I want to bring back what Lina was mentioning earlier, which is the surge of incidents of racism and targeted discrimination against African migrants in China in particular, and some reported in broader Asia. And it was noteworthy because African ambassadors, as you written about, in China issued a joint complaint against the foreign ministry. So, I mean, does this racism of ordinary migrants in Asia shatter myths about the depth of closeness between the two continents? Was that moment last year sort of important to sort of reorient how we understand the relationship between China and Africa, as well as Asia and Africa?
And can you, before you answer it, can you also, perhaps as part of it, also revisit some of that history? In other words, one of the questions which we didn't ask earlier from either Chris or Lina was how much of these kind of relations between the two continents are mostly the relations between great men or between kind of states, and it has very little effect at a mass level among regular people. And I'm curious particularly about Asia, and I know we're just talking, the example we're mostly talking about is China, because China is so dominant in this relation. But how much of that of the racism that we see now is new, and how much of it is widespread, and how, did any of these kind of Bandung style third world politics, could it even like do anything to it? Could it change it?
Thank you so much for bringing back that essential point. I think before moving on to the incident or the racism, crisis that took place last year in April 2020, I think it's important to keep in mind that racism basically, again, focusing on China because, the largest community, African community, are basically located in the country. I think there is no doubt. I mean, there is no doubt that, the issue has been there, has always been there. And the issue will always, be there, before and after, COVID crisis. And essentially, one distinction point from my point of view is that I think there is the politics of state or the official, politics, the official narrative, and also like the politics. There is also the politics of, people like students like myself in China or, African traders in the country. The official, politics or the official narrative is the one polished because there are great statements of, China being a friend of African countries and African countries also stating their love affairs toward the country. But beyond that, I think it's important to keep in mind that the reality actually is, the daily life or the lived reality, I would say, is, different in the sense that the narrative, the official narrative, does not always, show or depict the, daily lives or the daily experiences. Going back to racism incident, like the history has been repeating itself, starting from, Chinese student, beating African student in various colleges or the various universities throughout, Chinese cities, even long before China has become, start to become what it is today, like a great power as such. We had that incident in Beijing, where African student basically got, beaten, and that demonstration to show that, there is a narrative of, Africa being or China being, a friend of African countries, but the reality is pretty different. So that brings me to the incident last year. Yes, I think Willie was right to point out that, there were diplomatic reactions, unlike what, used to be, because in China-Africa relations, usually when it comes to, incident like this, like conflicting, incident that calls into, questioning the nature of that relationship, it goes, under the carpet. Basically, no one says anything. But I think last year's incident could be seen as, a breaking point in the sense that, there was a reaction from, African nationals, not only in China, but also back at home. We saw that in Nigeria, we saw that in Kenya, we saw that, throughout African countries, and also like parliamentaries, members of, parliament, like reacting beyond like the diplomatic from the foreign ministry or, deep, ambassadors in, in China, where actually many ambassadors, send or sign an open letter to the foreign ministry, like protesting the incident and also calling for, a quick, action from the Chinese government. But I think, yeah, although that is, laudable, I think there should, there are more steps that could be taken in the sense that, yes, after that reaction, basically, the issue is no longer talked about. For example, the incident passed as if, it was not anything, but I think that was actually an opportunity that African countries could seize to redefine their, relation with the Asian giant, in the sense that I think the incident opened, a door in allowing African countries to push for more say in the bilateral relation, in the sense that, beyond, regardless of how smooth the diplomatic relations are, I think it's important to recognize that, not only is it unbalanced, but also like most of the shots are called by China. And this is, from my perspective at least, is a missed opportunity. And but also broadly speaking, in terms of COVID-19 and the impact it has on, China's, Africa relations beyond the official one. I think there is the perspective in terms of, African communities in China of being more squeezed. Before COVID, for example, one could, there was always a possibility of people staying illegal. But with COVID and the growing, technology, including facial recognition, for example, I think it's much more challenging today for someone to stay, beyond their visa, the validity of their visa in the country. So that shows you the way, health crisis that like this one also has an impact on, communities, including African communities in China, for example.
So I think this is a great point to sort of try and consolidate the episode that we've just had. And if our other guests are available, then they're welcome to jump on. But it's interesting, talking about what you've just described now. I'm curious to know how is Africa perceived? So what does Africanness mean in Asia? So we've always known that in the Western world, Africa had this association as being the Conradian heart of darkness. At some point, Africa was rising, and it was this great place of industrious youth who were starting their own small businesses and who were gonna, elevate everyone out of poverty. But we don't really hear much about what Africa means in the eyes of ordinary Asians. And I'm curious to know, and Chris, you can also jump in here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just to chime in, I mean, I appreciate your question, but there's also something about the question that frustrates me, to register this. And it's more specific to the fact that, I mean, you have, it's for lack of a better expression, you have Africans of Asian descent. You have, you have South Africans who are Chinese South African. You have Indian South Africans and so forth. So this sort of discrete worldview where you have Asia, Africa,
Asia,
I mean, I think this is something that, I mean, these are huge issues, and long conversations. So I don't pretend to that we would be able to talk about it completely. But this is something that frustrates me about China-Africa relations and Asia-Africa relations, is that it can neglect the fact that, you have long histories of Chinese residents in South Africa. Of course, there's an imperial history to this. You have Indian communities across, East Africa, Southern Africa. You have Lebanese communities in West Africa. There are all these connections. And the reason why we don't really talk about them, or they don't show up in scholarship, is because there's still this this set of imperial epistemologies about what is Africa, what is Asia, and the area studies model in the United States basically is, a replica of this imperial worldview where you have discrete continents that are highly racialized, that have their own histories, where there are no real connections. And this is a source of frustration for me. And when I did my book, Making World After Empire, it was very much about trying to break that area studies paradigm and, really take seriously the fact that you have these connections. And that's why the Bandung moment is, to me at least, so important, not just at the time, but in the present, because it actually provides a foundation for thinking about these connections, both preceding Bandung and also, as discussed by Lina and Abdu, just connections after, well after Bandung in the present. So anyway,
I get your frustration with that, but I think there's also I would say that outside the US, many of these conversations, there's a certain matter-of-factness to them. For example, I don't think anybody in South Africa questions, and I wrote about this recently, about the kind of founding of Islam in South Africa. There is no, the Muslim community, for example, in South Africa, a large part of it, I mean, of course, there's one part that always gets downplayed, which is its Africanness, but a large section of it came to South Africa with slavery in the 16th century. And there is a way in which nobody questions, unlike in other places where there is, you know, Orientalism or Islamophobia. There is just they're part of South Africanness. You know, they're South African. Nobody questions their like position in the struggle or their position as a government minister. They are South Africans. So there's places in which there are tensions around these identities. As you said, this is something for another long conversation, whether it's Kenya, Uganda. I just read the other day in Kenya, there's a debate about making Indian Kenyans or Asian Kenyans of Asian origin, to make them another one of the 40 odd tribes of Kenya. So like, you know, so those debates, those things are long, and I think we shouldn't. I agree with you. We should not underestimate. But I think outside the U.S., for example, if you think in South Africa, you know, which is an academic space I kind of know well, there's an Indian Ocean, kind of very vibrant Indian Ocean studies that are being done at Wits University, where they connect themselves to other universities, you know, elsewhere on the continent. Lina probably knows this way better than I do, but there's a way vibrant scholarship going on between China and Africa. Abdu mentions like the exchanges of students and so on. But I think what I think maybe we sort of driving at is at a very popular level, right? There are discourses that always circulate, and in the West, that I'd be curious, like in the Chinese public sphere, or probably maybe Japan, I think less so in some of the other smaller countries. Is that sort of thing happening there too, in that way in Africa keeps shifting? Like Africa is
to jump in there.
Then it's this.
Yeah, to jump in quickly, I think friend of the show, Bhakti Sringapur, puts it really well in the comments. She says, unfortunately, those imperial epistemologies have been internalized by Africans and Asians, you know, terms we need to problematize at some point too. And this is a huge issue in terms of building relations across these identities. So
absolutely.
Yeah, Abdurrahman,
this is what I'm getting at. This is precisely, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Chris is right about, you know, that frustration. But also, like, there is a reality to which we have to, you know, at least recognize. If you are not able to do anything about it, I think the least we can do is to recognize it. One example, one could, you know, a prominent example, even last year, it did happen again. The incident starting from the detergent incident, like the concept of blackness, the concept of, you know, I think the commentator put it quite right in the sense of internalizing that, you know, imperial, you know, way of being great in a sense, or that imperial way of being the standard, basically. I think is quite prominent. I can speak of China, the case I know, you know, better. For example, you know, the gala event, like, you know, for the, you know, Chinese New Year celebration and so on and so forth. I think that reflects that. And these are like issues, they are unfortunate, but I think they do happen. Last year it did happen again. And people were asking, like, where do we start? Like, because the first was, you know, was considered to be a mistake. But, you know, after a mistake repeating itself, I think then people should ask questions of, you know, what it is really, how it is, what perception African have, or what are the perception people have of, you know, Africanness in a sense, in China and in Asia, broadly speaking. So I think, like, yeah, these are, you know, important discussions we need to have.
Lina, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add. I think I agree with the frustration that Chris put forward, because in a way it also just oversimplifies all the complexities of the histories of interactions, and it just makes, you know, very easy categories, and that's very problematic on so many levels. But as Lima was describing the detergent incident and the gala incident, I also was thinking of when Black Panther was screening and it came out in China, and we could see just, you know, regular average Joe's reviews on WeChat and QQ and the comments we were getting about how it was received in China, I mean, it gives you a bit of an idea of this very problem of internalizing the representations of blackness and what blackness means. And a lot of those reviews, I mean, obviously it's always a mixed bag. Like you can find this and the other. But a lot of those reviews were quite revealing of how blackness is perceived in China.
And I suppose this is why, to echo what Chris was saying just now, this is why the Bandung moment is so important to recall as a usable past, to use your turn of phrase, Chris, because as you were saying, Africa was the destination for that conference, and I'm curious to hear you unpack that now, because when you described that this conference had 29 national representatives, only 6 of those countries were actually located on the continent, but there was a way in which everyone identified with Africa, that Africa went beyond, as we've been discussing, these imperial epistemologies of demarcating a specific kind of racialization or geographical origin. Africanness meant this political posture that anyone could adorn, including Asians.
Let me make a few quick remarks. One thing, I see a difference between Africanness and Blackness. I see Africanness as more capacious, and Blackness, of course, relating to Blackness. I mean, but I think too often they're seen as synonymous. And just to go to a quick reference, Achille Mbembe has this important article. He has a number of important articles, but everybody's drawn to necropolitics. He has an article called African Modes of Self-Writing. And he talks a lot about this issue. And he basically says that the concept of an Africanness that is not Black is simply unthinkable. And basically we need to make an Africanness that's more capacious thinkable. And I think, that's a project that's well worth undertaking. To get to your remark, William, about the destinations of Afro-Asianism, just to give some brief examples, like Nasser, after the Bandung Conference, established the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization in Cairo. Nasser was very committed to this idea of Afro-Asianism as being a foundation for thinking about third worldism. APSO proved to be much more cultural and I don't want to say less diplomatic, but more oriented around the exchange of ideas among artists, writers, journalists, cultural workers. And it also held a number of meetings on the African continent. And this actually goes to, one of the earlier remarks too. Do we see Bandung as simply, a moment of great men? How did it respond to people on the ground? How did it resonate with people on the ground? One thing that my book does is actually get at that social history. I mean, I'm trained as a social historian. I'm not a diplomatic historian. And a lot of the contributions to the book, my edited book, are looking at the ways that Afro-Asianism gained traction on the ground. So another example would be the Tazara Railway that links Zambia and Tanzania, that was funded by China. This is an early example of the kind of development diplomacy that the PRC still uses today. I look at the exile life of Alex Laguma, who became involved in the Afro-Asian Writers Association, published the journal Lotus. So you have all these, projects that are sort of mediating Afro-Asianism at different levels. It's not just about diplomacy. It's not just about, these large, development projects. It's also about, intellectuals recognizing that, the experience of colonialism in Africa is similar to the experience of colonization in Asia. And there are things to talk about. And so Laguma is a figure there. And so when I say destination, it's not as if there's a single narrative. it's important to think about, the multiplicity of narratives over time. And if anything, the thing about Bandung is, for me at least, and I talk about this in the new preface to the second edition of my book, it's more of a ripple effect. It's not so much, again, a single narrative, a single set of causal connections, but rather, we have to think about the ways in which this moment rippled in different ways to the present, but also in a sense rippled back to the past to sort of reorganize how we understand the history of Asia-Africa relations. And anyway, the point being that there's not a linear history, and I don't want to over-determine Bandung in that sense either, to say that it is the moment, the starting point. It's an important one, and if anything, it forces us to rethink the connections between these two continents, and again, to decolonize them, not just decolonize in a political sense, but again, to go back to this issue of epistemology, thinking about how we have inherited certain ways of looking at the world, certain ways of constructing questions about the past, and how the continental logic that we still work within bears traces of imperial knowledge. And I think, we need to work against that and just sort of understand. And to go back to Sean's point about Cape Town, Cape Town's one of the most Afro-Asian cities on the African continent. And, it's important to understand the deep history of, the deep connections with Malaysia through slavery, the fact that, Cape Town has the oldest mosque on the African continent, or excuse me, the oldest mosque in the Southern Hemisphere. There are things like this that I think are important to this history. So,
except I mean, again, we could go on and on and on. And I know Abdul wants to make a last comment just on that Cape Town thing. It's also interesting in which, and this piece I wrote, which was her, it's a new initiative. I think Lina is part of it too, which is the one based at Columbia with Zakaria Mampili and Hissam Mahidi and Mark Lynch. I think it's called the program on, this is terrible because I'm on the board, the program for the research in Africa. But anyway, one of the things I found interesting about that debate was how also the way that the history of Islam gets written in Cape Town, and to foreground its Asianness, to not make it African. So yes, there is a way in which Islam in Cape Town is, as you said, the way in which there's a dynamic relationship between its Africanness and its Asianness, but it's also done often at the expense of its Africanness. So Islam came, more than half of the slaves who came either from Southeast Africa, or they came from Madagascar or the islands, and they were visibly Black African. But in the retelling, it's only because the scholars, the people who wrote the stuff down, they often came as political exiles. It's a class issue. They came from Asia. They then shape Islam, and that other part, that kind of like the lived Islam, if you want the street Islam, that Islam goes to the back, the African, and that's the one associated with Africa. And so in today, it becomes Islam is from Asia, Islam is from Asia. No, Islam was also from Africa when it came to that. So it's always complicated. As you said, it's dynamic, and that's in the decolonizing of it. That's the work we have to do. So I'm with you on that. Yeah.
And just to be quick, I don't mean to idealize either. I mean, there's certainly elements of anti-Blackness in these sets of politics, and so I'm attentive to that too. It's just being aware of these different layers, and being attentive to both the colonial legacies we still live with, and trying to deconstruct them. And then also, but at the same time, not idealizing, the kind of third worldism that also came out of Bandung. I mean, I think, there are good reasons for critiquing its limitations as well. So,
Abdul, you wanted to say something quickly, and then I think Will's going to tell us to get out of here.
No, I'm intrigued. I'm happy to stay here forever.
Yeah, just quickly to say something about Sambasek's question in terms of whether the Bandung Conference failed because it came too early. I think a good point to start from my perspective is what one considers a success, like success and failure for that particular conference. And I think being a child of its time, I think it was the only time it could have taken place, because in the 60s, yes, there were more African independent countries in the African continent. But also with the growth of that independent state came the division. And one example from my perspective, again, would be the Organization of African Union, Nkrumah having one idea that got dampened, in the African conference, basically deciding on the future of the continent. And if one is to add that to growing competition between China and the Soviet Union, that led to Sino-Russian war, border war. I think that shows the division. So I would say that it was only that time that it could have taken place. And in terms of success, my way of considering it being a success is that it has given a foundation. I know that you consider that word being boring, but it gave a solid foundation for what is now called the Global South. And if one reads text on South-South cooperation, I think whichever relation or whichever principles is traced back to that conference. So we see how history, or how that historical event has become the basics or the foundation of today's dialogue in terms of developing world, in terms of cooperating between those countries to promote development and alleviate poverty and so on and so forth.
Speaking of foundations, thank you for that, Abdurrahim. I think this would be a good place for us to conclude. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Africa as a country is, I mean, for the people that make decisions, I'm thinking of the guy on my right here. We're always thinking about having conferences, and we're always thinking of having conferences in different parts of the world, and now we need to have an Africa as a Country festival, and we're always anxious for all of this to end. And
this was a great preview of what a festival of ideas could be like. This kind of
and maybe one in Bandung. I mean, maybe that's trying to tempt fate and history too much, but who knows?
But before you sign us out, I forgot to tell everybody that Chris is a contributing editor, so is Lina, and Abdul has been a solid contributor of Africa as a Country. We left that out, but a lot of this is also, a lot of what you saw here is the stuff that makes up Africa as a Country. All these wonderful people and their great ideas, and you may not, and if you don't see their writing on the site all the time, they're doing a ton of other stuff behind the scenes. So this is that kind of, if there was an office, I bet you this was what the office conversation physically could have been like. So this was wonderful. Yeah.
And we're happy to share it with everyone. So thank you everyone for watching. Thank you again deeply to Chris, to Abdurrahim Lema, to Lina for appearing on. Please read Chris's book, because that's when you're going to get a good
and read Lena's book. And read Lina's book
as well. Released last year. Abdurrahim is hopefully writing one at the moment. After this, he's going to go back to the keyboard. And we look forward to some of these ideas factoring. And thank you to Sean, my excellent co-host, and to Antoinette Engel, our excellent producer. And it's been a great episode. And the next one will be just as good. So stay tuned for that one as well. But until then, see you next time.